My name is Chelsea Rosebrook, and I'm the president of the Portland chapter of the Native Plant Society of Oregon. I'd like to especially welcome any new members tonight and encourage you to stick around for our social after the program. NPSO promotes the enjoyment, study, and protection of Oregon's native plants, and as part of our mission, we present a speaker each month on timely topics of interest to our members. Tonight, our speaker is Rebecca Lexa, who will be sharing tips on plant identification. First, let's go over some Zoom etiquette. Your audio and video should be turned off during the program. If you have any questions during the program, click the chat button at the bottom of your screen to type it into the chat box, and our speaker will address those questions as time allows at the end of the presentation. You may notice a closed caption feature, which you can click to enable. And you're also welcome to stay after the program, and we'll allow for audio and video to be turned on for conversations during that time. I have a couple of quick announcements from our chapter. While our board is mostly full this year, we are still looking for a volunteer to help run the publicity committee. So if you're interested in getting involved with our team, feel free to reach out to me, put something in the chat, and we can get you connected. We have many events going on this month as well. So just as a reminder, it's Native Plant Appreciation Month. And you can sign up for those events on our newsletter or also by looking at our Google Calendar. Another event that we want to highlight specifically is Rebecca's hike on Earth Day. It pairs really well with this program. So if you're free that day, definitely sign up for that one. Now I'll introduce our speaker, Rebecca Lexa. According to a sample field guide entry that was found in Rebecca's latest book, The Everyday Naturalist, her name, Rebecca Lexa, is a Homo sapien variety naturalista. Her height is 5 feet 3 inches. Description: pale skin with seasonal darkening, crest of light brown hair. Range: the Pacific Northwest, US, particularly the Columbia Pacific region. May be found as an occasional vagrant as far east as Missouri, her place of origin. Most likely encountered on trails throughout the Pacific Northwest, has various dens scattered throughout the region, including Long Beach, Washington. Was last seen near Sitka Arts Center along the Salmon River and below Cascade Heads near Otis, Oregon. Diet and behavior: omnivorous, although diet consists primarily of vegetative materials and cheese. May be enticed into the open for observations with chocolate and other sweets, found both in isolation or as part of a group, and tends to be loquacious in the presence of other Homo sapiens. When not observed in the open, wandering and journaling, often found in the vicinity of a computer or on Nextdoor. Similar species include other naturalists, especially Oregon naturalists and plant lovers, such as members of the Native Plant Society of Oregon. So after that little snippet that was from her book, we also want to note that Rebecca is a Oregon Master Naturalist, an educator, and a natural guide working in the Pacific Northwest. She teaches a wide variety of community-level natural history classes for adults and leads guided nature tours to help people better understand the incredible ecological treasures of our region. She is the author of The Everyday Naturalist: How to Identify Animals, Plants, and Fungi Wherever You Are. And there's more information about Rebecca on her website at rebeccalexa.com. Let's welcome Rebecca now.
All right. Thank you so much. Just want to say a quick hello to everybody. Thank you all for having me. Very excited to talk about one of my favorite topics tonight, which is basically getting people started with plant identification, especially if you don't have that specialized botanical background. So I'm going to go ahead and get us over to the PowerPoint. Which, by the way, if anybody wants the original PowerPoint, you are welcome to contact me after the class. I'm more than happy to email it to you as well. So yeah, this is basically plant identification for non-botanists, just like it says on the tin. And I put it together a few years ago just to give people some options for folks, especially for folks who may be feeling a little intimidated by things like dichotomous keys, or the fact that there are just so many plants out there this is really meant for just about anybody who's interested in plants. So we already kind of talked about me. Um, I just want to talk real quick about what we're going to be going over tonight. So we'll go very briefly over the difference between casual identification and scientific identification and how they intersect. We'll spend a good amount of time on what you want to pay attention to when you're observing a new to you plant. We'll look a little bit at some identification tools like books and apps and other things that might be useful. And then we'll wrap up with that Q&A. Okay. So jumping right in, casual identification. This is basically something you do for your own fun, for your own personal edification. There's no pressure to be absolutely perfect. And it's something that anybody can do. Okay, this is just every day. I want to know what this plant is. Now, scientific identification, this is much more rigorous. It's often done for research purposes, studies, surveys, etc. And so it's going to have uh, uh, more structure to it, more of a process, and there's going to be more focus on precision, particularly trying to get a plant down to species or even subspecies level. Okay, and often the people involved in this are going to have backgrounds in botany or other natural sciences. Now, here's the thing: these two types of identification are not mutually exclusive. They often rely on each other as we are all exploring the natural world. Okay, so good examples here. Many of the resources that we like to use in casual identification, like books and apps and websites and so forth, the information in all those largely came from botany and other scientific research and observation. So that's where we get the rigorous background that lets us know that this information in these resources is accurate. Okay. However, the nice thing about citizen science, even casual citizen science, like using iNaturalist, is it can be really helpful to professional scientists who can't be out in the field all the time as much as they would love to. Okay. And so sometimes there are observations done by everyday folks that actually make a big splash in the more formal scientific world. Really good example. This little plant here on the left here is the small world pogonia. Okay. And this plant was believed to be extinct because nobody had seen it in decades. And then an iNaturalist user in 2022 found this plant, took a picture of it, put it on iNaturalist, and other iNaturalist users, again, to include people who are, formal botanists, said, whoa, we thought that plant was long gone. And because this one person just happened to be in the right place at the right time and recorded that, it made a difference. So these, like I said, one is not better than the other. They both have their place. Okay. But we're going to be focusing primarily on skills for casual identification. Okay. So things you might want to take out into the field with you when you're going to be identifying plants. A field guide, of course. There are a whole bunch of them out there. I collect field guides. I have way more than any one person could ever possibly need. And there's a lot of great field guides on plants. Again, I'll give you some specific recommendations later on in the class. Now, I don't take the whole library out in the field with me. I take a couple of my favorites, and then I use the rest when I get home to help confirm any identifications I made while I was out and about. Okay. Smartphone, of course, you want to have that in case something goes wrong and you need help, you get lost, injured, whatever. But in better news, if you have Signal, you can access websites to help you with your identification. You can carry ebooks. So if your favorite field guide comes in ebook format, you buy the ebook, you download it to your phone, and you don't have to carry the paperback. And then, of course, ID apps. Now, a thing I'm going to mention about apps is you never want to use one as your only tool for identification. Okay. It's a nice starting point to give you some suggestions of what you might have found, but don't just use the app and end with that because apps can be wrong. Okay. And again, we're going to, if you have questions at these things as we go along, we will address that later on. All right. Now, another good thing to have: hand lens or magnifying glass. Okay. Just some little thing you can tuck into your pocket or your backpack, because sometimes you're going to be looking at little plants or little structures on little plants. and you want to get a really good look at it. And sometimes you're like me and your eyes aren't as good as they used to be. So it's nice to have that extra level of magnification. Okay. If you want to take a camera, that's fine. You know, a lot of us just take pictures with our phones, but if you have a really nice DSLR or film camera, you want to get some photos with that, that's fine. You can take that as well. Use that for your record keeping. Gloves. So you want to have a couple good sets of gloves, one of which will be a nice heavy set of gardening gloves, like rubber or fabric or canvas, whatever, you know, just nice heavy set of gardening gloves. And that's in case you're handling something that has lots of thorns or you're going through the underbrush, etc. You want to protect your hands. But also, you want to have a set of very thin rubber gloves, like surgical gloves, or you can even have those dishwashing gloves that go up to your elbow. And you want to have that if you're handling something and you don't know whether you might have an allergic reaction to it. Okay. Poison oak, of course, a lot of people are sensitive to the urushiol in poison oak. You get a nasty rash. A lot of people are sensitive to the urticating hairs on stinging nettle. So it's a good idea just to have those rubber gloves with you as well that are thin enough that you can still feel the plant, but your skin is protected from anything that might be irritating until you know what that plant is. Of course, you want to have weather and terrain appropriate clothing and footwear. Check your forecast before you go out and make sure you're dressed for the occasion. And make sure whatever you're wearing on your feet is going to be solid enough for where you're going to be. Okay. You want to have your good set of hiking boots to protect your feet, protect your ankles. You're going to want something to take notes in. It's entirely up to you, whatever works for you. Some people take a little journal, some people use a notebook app, some people make notes in their field guides, some people do art journaling. It's entirely up to you, but it's nice to be able to keep track of what you find. I generally just use my iNaturalist account to keep track of everything, but again, it's up to you what you want to use. And finally, you want to have something to carry specimens home in. Um, we'll talk more about that in a moment. If I'm collecting plants, I usually like to have a nice wide basket so I can lay the plant parts down nice and flat. Unless I'm just, you know, not going too far. And then I take a plant press with me and I'll just put things into the plant press pages as I'm going along. Or I might temporarily tuck something into my field guide and then press it more formally when I get home. Now, as far as specimens go, my general rule, I don't do a lot of collection. Um, Usually I'm take only pictures, leave only footprints. And the great thing about having access to these great cameras on our phones is that we can take all these pictures from different angles and plants will hold still for you. So you've got plenty of opportunity to get good pictures. Um, and then I make my notes and I upload finds to apps, et cetera, et cetera. And I basically do everything I can to avoid having to take samples. If I need to take samples, I generally only do it from common native species. And that's usually if I'm going to need it for like an art reference. If I'm going to be doing some drawing and I want an actual three-dimensional reference rather than a photo. Okay. If you're going to collect a common native species, make sure it's from a location where collection is legal. Okay. For example, public lands. Some public lands allow collection, some do not. So you want to contact whoever is in charge of that place before you go to see if you're able to take things. Okay. You also want to make sure the species is abundant in that spot. Okay. Because, for example, some species that may grow in large patches in one spot, the next population may be miles away. Great example, ghost pipe, Monotropa uniflora, which you see here in the picture. You know, yeah, you might find a patch of it, but then the next patch may be several miles away. Okay. And so just because it's abundant in one area doesn't mean it's abundant across the board. And if you are going to take a sample, please only take what you need for your records. Don't take a whole huge bunch of it. Now, the exception to this is non-native and especially invasive non-native species. Those you're welcome to take as much as you want. Okay. All right. So when you find a new plant that you don't recognize, Here are going to be some things that I look for. I'm basically taking my personal process that I've used for the last 20 years, and I've broken it down into teeny tiny little bits and pieces. Okay. Just like I did in my book, The Everyday Naturalist. And so you can take these, use them as they work for you. And so I'm keeping things pretty simple. Okay. I'm not doing things the way that a formally trained botanist is going to necessarily go about it. Okay. But our goal is still going to be the same. Try and get a positive identification. If you get it down to species level, great. If not, if you can get at least get down to genus or family, that's a great start. Okay. But again, this is my toolkit. Use it as you will. So, color, there are three big things that people notice the most: color, size, and shape. Those are the big trifecta of traits that people are most likely to notice first. Not necessarily in that order, but I will say with plants, especially with flowers, fruits, etc., color is really common for people to notice first and foremost, okay? Because it stands out. All right. Um, Generally, a plant's going to be green, but as you look more closely, you're going to notice different shades of green, other colors, not just with flowers, but on other parts of the plant as well. And so I generally will take the time to really study that plant and then figure out, okay, what's the sort of like most noticeable color? But then after that, how, what are the little detail colors? And those little detail colors can really make a difference. Great example, poison hemlock on the left, Queen Anne's lace on the right. They're both in the carrot family. They look very similar. They have very similar flowers, very similar leaves, very similar overall structures. But poison hemlock has purple spots on the stem. Queen Anne's lace does not. Now, Queen Anne's lace is edible. Okay, it's the wild forerunner of our domestic carrot. Okay, poison hemlock is edible once. Okay, it's highly toxic. It's what was used to kill Socrates. So it's basically something you really don't want to eat if you want to keep on living. And so I tell my foraging students, because I teach foraging classes, if you see the purple spots, don't eat that because it will kill you. Okay. Also, as a little side note, Queen Anne's lace has hairy stems and poison hemlock has smooth stems. So if you want to remember which one is which, just remember the queen has hairy legs. Now, and that brings us to texture, conveniently enough. So there are two types of texture when you're trying to identify a plant: your visual texture and your tactile texture. Visual is just, what does it look like? This plant looks velvety. That one looks leathery. Okay. Tactile is when you actually touch it. And again, don't forget your gloves if you don't know what it is. This plant feels fuzzy. That one feels prickly. And so these are important things to put into your notes, because sometimes identification can come down to that texture. Okay. Now, the visual and tactile textures don't always match. Those of you who like succulents, especially your cacti, there are certain cacti out there that look very soft and fuzzy, and they look very pettable. But that when you pet them, they are very much not pettable. They have those very fine thorns, spines that break off in your skin, and then they stay there for days, being irritating the whole time. They're really horrible. Yet you really don't want to pet those. So sometimes the visual texture and the tactile texture don't necessarily match. Okay. Again, be cautious when you're handling an unknown plant. Use your gloves, use long sleeves, other protective layers. When in doubt, look, don't touch. Okay. All right, here are just a few examples. These are all plants where the visual texture and the tactile texture pretty well match. Okay, we've got a nice, soft, fuzzy moss. We've got a rough oak tree trunk with a leathery oak leaf. We have a spiky cactus, etc., etc. So these are examples where the visual texture just happens to match the tactile texture. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about textures, okay? Now, for size, you're going to look at size on a few different levels. All right, you want the overall size of the individual plant. You want the size of various components, like the length, the width, and the diameter of things like the leaves, flowers, stems, and trunks, etc. So take some measurements, okay? They're actually some of my favorite field guides from, I believe, Timber Press. They have a ruler on the back cover, which is great. Or just take a little tape measure with you, or have a ruler app on your phone, okay? Just take your measurements, because when you're looking through your field guides, often your field guide is going to say leaves are, for example, 3 to 5 inches long, or flowers are 2 inches in diameter, things like that. So you want to be able to compare the sizes of the various parts of your mystery plant to the sources you are checking and make sure they match. Okay. Also, if you have multiple examples of the same plant that you can look at, compare the size, get a good sense of the size range. Especially this time of year, we have a lot of emergent plants that are just starting to grow for the year. They're not fully grown. So you may not know what their full size is necessarily. Do the best with what you have, take those measurements, and then take them home and start working with them. Okay. Um, if your plant you're looking at is smaller than the size range in your field guide, especially this time of year, don't rule it out entirely. Look at other things. But if your mystery plant is much larger than the plant you're looking at in your field guide, you can probably rule it out. Okay. If you see a big plant that looks like it's in the carrot family, but it's like 7 feet tall, that's probably not going to be Queen Anne's lace. That's probably going to be cow parsnip. Okay. So sometimes size is a good way to rule things out, especially if your mystery plant is bigger than the size range in your field guides. Okay. Now, here's a good example. Brazilian elodea and Canadian elodea. Brazilian is on the left in both photos. Canadian elodea is on the right. Brazilian is invasive. Canadian is native. Okay. Now, at first glance, if you find a big bundle of these, because they often grow together, if you find a big bunch of these in the shallows of a lake, you might assume they're the same plant. But if you follow these stems all the way down to the root, you're going to find that Brazilian elodea always has these bigger leaves, and your Canadian elodea always has the smaller ones. Okay. So one of the things I tell my students in my field classes is make sure you follow the plant all the way to the root or the ground so that you know exactly what parts are part of which plant. Okay. Now, the next area to get into is shapes. And I want to go back to the elodea here for a second for shapes. Okay. Because we notice with the cross section, both of these elodeas grow in whorls around the stem. Your Brazilian elodea has long lance-shaped leaves that are fairly narrow with a little pointed tip, and they tend to grow in groups of 4 to 8 in one little whorl. Your Canadian elodea has these little bitty triangular, almost mouse ear type leaves, and they're teeny tiny little things. Okay, that's another size difference. Okay, you're never going to see Canadian elodea with these big, long, inch-long leaves, but they're also never going to be those long, pointy, lance-shaped leaves, and they're almost always going to be in multiples of 3. Okay, so size and shape can help you tell the difference between these two species. Also with shape, as with size, you're going to observe the shape of the entire plant. Especially with a big tree, you may need to walk back quite a bit to get a shape, to get a look at the whole plant. But you also want to get the shapes of individual pieces and parts, because both the overall shape and those bits and pieces can be important diagnostic criteria when you're trying to figure out what species you're looking at. Now, these are not Northwest trees. These are from where I grew up in the Missouri Ozarks, but I think they're a great example just to bring up. Okay. So we have here 2 young understory trees that you often find in the oak hickory forests of the Missouri Ozarks. Okay. Your flowering dogwood and your common redbud. or your eastern redbud. Okay. So at first glance, they look very similar. There's these kind of spreading wide understory trees, doing their best to try to gather whatever light they can underneath bigger trees. But then you start looking at more the detail shapes. So even if there weren't the leaves and the flowers to compare, just look at the shape here. Look at the trunk of the dogwood here on the right. Okay. It's basically one straight trunk with some beams, kind of branching off of it, but one main trunk. Whereas your eastern redbud splits into these sort of more substantial sub trunks pretty early on. And so even if I were to look at these two trees in the dead of winter, I'd be able to tell the difference just by the basic structure. Okay. And there are other details I could bring up with shape, but I just want to give you this as an idea of the kind of thing I'm looking at when I'm comparing shapes of the overall plant. Okay. But now I want to get a little bit more into details. Okay. So, for example, let's come back here to the Pacific Northwest. On the left, we have Himalayan blackberry, which of course we know is a very highly invasive species. And on the right, we have its native counterpart, trailing blackberry. All right. And so we're looking specifically at the stems. So your Himalayan blackberry has these big, thick, heavy canes that are kind of ribbed vertically, and they have these big, heavy, sharp, pointy thorns where there's some space in between them. Okay. In fact, if you're really careful, I can actually wrap my fingers between the thorns if I need to get a grip on it. Okay. Um, Trailing blackberry, on the other hand, has these very thin little vines. They don't get these big ribbed canes. It's got these thin little vines, and the thorns are tiny and they're very packed tightly in. Okay. And by the way, they're horrible to get in your skin because they'll break off and then they're in there for days, irritating, irritating, irritating. Definitely want to have gloves if you're dealing with trailing blackberry. I'd rather get stuck by a Himalayan blackberry thorn because it's at least going to stay where it is. Okay. So just by looking at the difference in the stems of these plants, I can already tell which one is which. Now, yes, there are some young Himalayan blackberries that just get started that are very thin and look kind of vine-like. And that's when you look at other things like leaves and so forth. But this is just an example of basics in identifying a plant by shapes. Okay. And here, real quick, is just a quick diagram because here's the thing: reproductive structures are among some of the best features to use in identification because they happen to be so incredibly distinctive in many species. All right. So this real quick, and again, if you want this, you can get this PowerPoint from me if you want. But this is just a quick diagram of the parts of a flower because you're going to run into these terms when you're doing your research. Your field guides and other sources are going to mention things like the stigma and petals and sepals, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just to kind of show you the different bits and parts if you're not already familiar with them. Okay. I'm not going to go into detail on this. This is to give you a quick little idea of what those refer to. Also, leaves. Leaves are so important. Okay. And this chart and the next one, this is just two halves of the same chart. It's just long and skinny. I cut it in half for you. These just show this is an illustrated guide to common terms for different shapes and arrangements of leaves. So you know what your field guide is talking about when they say a rhomboid shaped leaf or a peltate leaf. And here's the thing. You notice how the lanceolate leaf and the linear leaf kind of look similar? Here's the thing. Sometimes you're going to get a leaf and you can't tell which one is which, and it might be kind of intermediary between the two, and that's okay. These are general categories. Sometimes your leaf is not going to be exact. Sometimes it's going to be somewhere in the middle. That's okay. Sometimes your field guide will say lanceolate to linear, because a plant may have leaves of variable shape, and that's okay. This is just to give you an idea of what the terms are basically referring to. All right. Same thing with leaf margin, the edges of your leaves. Okay. Again, you may not necessarily know the difference immediately between, well, is it a denticulate or is it a cerulate? And you might have to look into that a little bit. But again, this is just to show you what those terms generally refer to. And finally, venation. Okay. So your leaf shape, your leaf margins, and your leaf venation. Those are the three big things you want to pay attention to with leaves to help you make notes of what shape they are, and then use that in your research. Okay. So venation. A lot of times we see leaves that are cross venulate or pinnate. There are a lot of leaves like that where you have a main stem and then, or main vein, and then veins branching off. And with your cross venulate, there are sub veins kind of connecting them. Um, Sometimes you'll have parallel where all the veins just run from one end to the other and they never cross over, and so on and so forth. Okay. Again, this is just so you know what those terms mean. All right. So conifer needles are a special kind of leaf. And so there's some special things to keep in mind when you're examining them. You want to pay attention to the length as well as the overall shape, but you also want to snip a needle in half and see what the cross section looks like. Okay, because sometimes they're square, sometimes they're triangular, et cetera. And those little details, your field guides are going to mention things like that. So you want to take note of what the shape and the length and the diameter and so forth of your needles are. You also want to pay attention to how many needles grow out of one node on the branch. Okay, so for example, we have, I believe this is a shore pine, and it's got two needles coming out of one node. Okay, this is, I think, some kind of white pine, and it's got five needles coming out of one little node. All right, and so even if all I had were these needles, I would definitely know that they're different, a different species because of how many needles are coming out of the node. Now look here, we have, I think this is a Douglas fir, and we just have one needle coming out of one spot. Okay, so pay attention to that node, but also pay attention to the length. These pine needles are much longer than these smaller pine needles, and they're longer than your Douglas fir. These are not these are not to scale, but if you had them all together, these would definitely be the longest that you have. Okay. All right. So shapes and arrangements of the reproductive parts. Again, if you have access to the plant's reproductive parts at any stage, that's going to be one of the most important cues because, again, these are some of the most distinctive parts of the plant. So on the left here, we have the flowers and the berries of evergreen huckleberry. Okay. And just for a quick little description, your flowers of your evergreen huckleberry are about the size of my pinky fingernail, so less than an inch long, and they're bell shaped. They're kind of round, and then the bottoms of the petals kind of bell out a little bit. They're white with a little bit of pink on the end, and the sepals are green with a little bit of pink, and the sepals are kind of pointed. And you notice that maybe sometimes you see a little bit of the pistil or the stamen sticking out with a little bit of yellow. And then you notice that they grow in clusters at the end of the stems. And of course, your berries are also going to be in clusters because the berries come from the flowers. The berries, again, are maybe no more than a half inch across, usually less. And they're going to be dark blue to black. And they're going to be perfectly round except for a little navel at the end where the flower was. And then you look at the leaves and you can get the details of the leaves, etc. But that's what I'm talking about. We got the size, we got the shape, we got color, we got arrangement, just in that little description I gave you of the flowers and the berries of evergreen huckleberry. Okay, same thing over here. These are the cones of, oh gosh, I forget which true fir. It's one of the true firs, maybe noble fir. And you notice that these big heavy cones, you really don't want them falling on your head. They're not fun. but you notice that they're pointing straight up, like candles, like somebody just set a bunch of candles on the branches of this fir tree. Okay. And they're kind of chunky, and the scales are kind of very close together, got this sort of diamond pattern to it. That's your true fir. Now, your Douglas fir cone looks very different. Because Douglas fir is not actually a true fir, it's a pine. Okay. And it's got these pendulous cones that hang down. They're much more slender. They have these little mouse tails hanging out. There's an adorable little story about that from some of the indigenous people um, in the Douglas firs range. We'll talk about that another time. But anyway, just by looking at the arrangement and the shape, you know these are two totally different trees. Okay. So again, your reproductive structures are really, really super important for identification. Okay. All right. Use your sense of smell. We know that flowers smell good, but we also know that other parts of some plants smell good, like sage. When I go out to Eastern Oregon, I love crushing sage leaves and smelling the sage as I go along. Okay. Skunk cabbage. We got Western skunk cabbage all over the place. And it definitely has a very strong odor, especially on a warm day. So if you notice a particular aroma with a particular plant, whether that's the flowers, the leaves, the fruit, whatever, make note of it, because often your field guides and other sources mention these things as a distinctive characteristic. Location. Where did you find this plant? What kind of habitat is it in? Does it like to be near water? Does it like sun or shade? Is it growing in dry or wet soil? Does it seem to grow in areas where the soil is really thin, or does it like deeper, richer soil? Okay. And does it seem to grow consistently in the vicinity of another species? Okay. So pay attention to all these details and more as far as where it grows, because that's going to tell you something about that plant's typical habitat. And again, your field guides and etc. will often say such and such plant likes to grow in wetlands, or such and such plant prefers to grow on rocky outcroppings with thin soil. The other thing to pay attention to is, does this plant tend to grow by itself, or do you find it in groups? Okay. You're almost never going to find, for example, a salmonberry by itself. You're always going to find these big clusters of salmonberry thickets. On the other hand, you go out through the Willamette Valley into some of the oak savanna that's left. There's not a whole lot of it left, but it's still there. And you might find an oak tree that's separated from the next oak tree by like a quarter mile or more. So pay attention to whether it tends to grow with others or whether you're finding it by itself. The other thing with location, when you are figuring out what plant you might have found, maybe you have a few different species that look like it. You want to make sure the species you think you found actually grows in the area where your mystery plant was growing. Okay. If you've got two species that look like your mystery plant, and species A grows in the Northwest and species B does not, it's more likely to be species A, with the caveat that people plant things all over the place. We have a lot of non-native species in the area. So if you're in a place where you know there's been a lot of cultivation, species B could have been planted there just for the fun of it. That's part of what makes doing plant identification a little more difficult when you're in an urban area, just because of all the exotic plants. Okay. But if you're in a place where you know the plants are largely native, go for the species that is native to that area rather than its non-native lookalike. Okay. Same as location, pay attention to what time of year you're observing the plant, especially if you have flowers, fruit, cones, etc. Because most species are going to have a pretty narrow window where those reproductive parts are going to be at a particular stage. Okay. Skunk cabbage, within the next month, most of those skunk cabbage flowers will be basically gone to seed. Okay. So they've got that narrow window. All right. Leaves. Of course, our deciduous plants lose their leaves. So if you're walking around in the middle of January and you find a plant that's not a conifer, or find a plant that's not a conifer that's got leaves, that's really going to narrow down what it could possibly be. Okay. And again, if you've got two very similar species that look like your mystery plant and they have flowers or leaves or whatever at the same time of year, or they have very similar flowers or leaves. If species A normally has flowers this time of year and species B does not, it's more likely to be species A, with the caveat that climate change is sometimes causing some plants to flower earlier, and otherwise affect plant phenology. That's a typo down there, ignore that. When plants grow, when they flower, when they dormant, etc. We're not seeing across the board changes, but we have been noticing some spring emergent wildflowers coming up earlier. We've noticed some deciduous trees budding earlier, etc., etc. So we may be noticing some of this phenology shifting due to climate change. All right. But for the most part, the patterns are still generally the same. All right. So all that stuff that I just got done talking to you about for like the last 10, 15 minutes, what do you do with all that information? Because it is a lot of information. All right. So if you're just getting started with plant identification, you might want to write everything down. Because I've been doing this for 20 years, I tend to process most of this information in the matter of a few seconds of observing this plant, just because I've done it so much. And the more you practice identification, the more noticing all these details, color, size, shape, texture, phenology, etc., that's going to come more natural to you just because of practice. And it all becomes really important when you're using the following resources to try to figure out what you've got. You're a detective gathering clues, and then you're going to use those clues to solve your mystery. And some of the clues, some of the tools you're going to have are things like field guides. Okay. I always reach for my field guides first. Okay. Because they're these great collections of species profiles, common and scientific names, pictures, range maps, etc. Some of them are very general. They cover all the plants of a certain type in North America. Some of them go into specific types. Some of them go into specific areas. And there's so many out there. Okay. Most bookstores are going to have some. Gift shops at parks and other public lands are going to have some. Even if you just have a few, that's a great starting point. Okay. You don't need the huge library that I have at home. If I think I know what I found, I'll just look up at my field guide. If I don't know, I might look through the table of contents or the index, see if something like, jogs my memory or sounds familiar. I also just take time to just kind of, if I have like a little bit of time in the evening, I might just flip through a field guide just to familiarize myself with plants I don't know. And then when I find that plant in the wild later, because I've seen pictures of it, I'm like, oh, I know what that is. Okay. But if I have no idea, and I've got this mystery plant, I've taken my photos, I've taken my notes. When I get home, I might just start flipping through field guides. And every time I find a plant that looks like my mystery plant, I bookmark it. And then I keep going. And then when I'm done, I go back and I compare all my bookmarked plants and see which one is the best match for my mystery plant. Okay. It's nice to have a few to compare because different authors may have different opinions on things, etc. But don't feel that you have to have, like I said, 10, 10, 15, 20 field guides. All right. These are a few of my favorites to start with. If you're going to have just one, get Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast. It is complete. I mean, it's not complete, but it's pretty thorough. It's got a pretty broad overview of different types of plants. It's good, solid information. So if you're just going to start with one, get that one. Trees to Know in Oregon, Washington, and Shrubs to Know in the Pacific Northwest Forests. These are both really good books on those topics. They've been through several editions. They've been updated. Really good, solid books on those topics. Wildflowers of the Pacific Northwest, one of my favorite field guides because it organizes the plants by flower color, which is awesome. So if you find a plant and you don't know it, but the flowers are yellow, you go to the section on yellow flowers, you page through it, and hopefully your plant is there. Wetland plants of Oregon and Washington, that's another favorite because, again, it does exactly what it says on the cover. It's specifically on wetland plants of Oregon and Washington. And it's got some plants that I don't have in most of my other field guides. So that's why I like those really narrowly specific field guides, because sometimes they get into some of the more unusual stuff. Other useful books. These are not field guides, but they're really good for adding to your knowledge. I really like Botany in a Day because basically, if you like this idea of visually breaking down a plant into its components like leaves, flower parts, stems, etc., you will really like Botany in a Day because he teaches you how to identify common families of plants found in North America by those traits. Okay, like mints have square stems, or the Asteraceae have radiant petals, things like that. Okay, it won't teach you proper botany in a day. The title's kind of hyperbolic, but it is kind of a fun thing that you can do a little bit at a time. Plant identification terminology. This is an illustrated glossary, and it's amazing because if you keep running into botanical terms you don't recognize, you look up the term, and not only is there a definition, but there's an illustration of what that definition is of, so you can see what the thing looks like. Really super useful. And then just to give you a basis in botany, if you're familiar with gardening, Botany for Gardeners. It's a really great way to use your garden as a way of learning basic botanical concepts. All right. So smartphone apps. Leaf Snap and Picture This. These are both basically well, first of all three of these are free and all of them work on all smartphones. But Leaf Snap and Picture This, you can take a picture of it. It tells you what it thinks it is. It also gives you care information. And it generally they both use just algorithms for identification. Okay. So it sifts through the database to find things that look like the plant you just took a picture of and does its best to find a good match. Now, I prefer iNaturalist. Again, it's free and it can identify any living thing, animal, plant, fungus, etc. It uses algorithms for that initial identification, but then other iNaturalist users, which includes a lot of botanists and mycologists and other experts, other people can go onto your identification and say, yeah, I agree with you, or I think it's this instead. Okay. And that additional layer of human verification is why I prefer, one of the reasons I prefer iNaturalist. Okay. No app is perfect. Any app can be wrong, but these are three that you can play with and see which one you like the best for your plant toolkit. Okay. If you're going to use apps, my recommendation is with something like iNaturalist, where you can put more than one photo. Take a picture of the whole plant, then start taking pictures of like leaves, flowers, stems, bark, etc., and add it all on your observation of that one plant because it gives both the algorithms and the human users more to work with. Okay. Now, not all apps are going to save your observations, but if yours does, make sure you hit that save button or you're going to lose your information. And again, never use an ID app as your only tool because they're not 100% accurate. You always want to verify stuff with field guides, websites, other naturalists, etc. All right, for websites, if you think you know what you found, just search for it and see if the information you find matches the plant that you found. Okay. State and federal natural resource departments often have good information on native species on the websites. Also, you can access your account on iNaturalist.org or on the app, and you can search for the species in the Explore tab and see if anybody else has observed it in your area. Okay, so you just go on iNaturalist, click Explore, put in the species that you think you found, and see if it actually does show up in your area. Okay, wildflowersearch.org, really awesome site for searching for wildflowers in your area. And you can use it, I think, anywhere across the United States. And not specifically identification related, But if you want to add more native plants to your garden or yard or property or whatever, the Native Plant Finder is a really cool tool. You just put in your zip code and it tells you the plants that you can put in that are best for local pollinators. So, really cool tool there just to add into the list. All right, other nature nerds, both the Oregon and the Washington Native Plant Society, Oregon Master Naturalist, other conservation group members have a lot of experience and information on this stuff. So you can email and or go, or if you're a member, go to a meeting and ask people there because we're all plant nerds. And there's a lot of experience and knowledge among these folks. University natural history departments often have staff or students who might be able to help with identification. So email them, send them a picture. State and federal parks and refuges, they may have a staff biologist who knows about the native species. So again, drop them an email and ask and say, hey, I found this. Do you know what it is? If you want to talk to nature nerds online, these are 3 of my favorite Facebook groups. They're all really good for discussion. You can also post pictures of plants you found. If you think you know what it is, it's like, well, can you verify? Or, just get some help with, what is this thing anyway? I recommend at least doing your own research first. And then if you can't figure it out, asking these folks, yeah, it's not this, it's not that. What is it? Okay. I know I'm kind of running through this. I just want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. We're almost done with my presentation. So troubleshooting. What do you do if you have multiple species that look like your mystery plant? Sometimes it comes down to tiny, tiny little details. So go through those traits like color, size, shape, et cetera, and compare very carefully. Because sometimes it comes down to 1 or 2 tiny little things. Research the candidate species. See if anybody in your field guides or other resources says, yeah, this species is very similar to this other species. Here's how you tell the difference. Okay. I am in the middle of a month-long residency out at the Sitka Center on the Oregon coast. I'm basically doing a plant survey on an 80-acre parcel that they bought a few years ago. And I've had to do that a few times where I've basically had, well, I got this moss and I'm not sure if it's this one or that one. And I'm having to like get out my, my magnifying glass and looking through all these resources to say, okay, good. This person says that this little detail is how you tell the difference between those 2 species. So I do that a lot. All right. If you're having trouble, I'm having trouble. Everybody's having trouble. It's not just you. And sometimes it's okay to say, well, I don't know. Maybe I'll figure it out later. Maybe you'll figure it out when somebody else shows you the plant later on, or maybe you'll read something. Okay. It's okay to just stick a pin in it now and come back to it later. All right. The one exception is if you're foraging and you want to eat it, never go with I don't know if you're going to eat it. Okay. That's my one caveat on that. All right. If you can't find the plant in your field guides are mostly focused on native species. So chances are really good if it's not in any of your field guides, it's not native. That's when you might need to use things like apps to help give you suggestions of what it might be. And if it's obviously cultivated, if it's in somebody's garden, there's a good chance it's not native. Also, frequently disturbed land like parks, roadsides, etc. Most of the plants you're going to find in those heavily traveled areas not going to be native. Okay. So before we take questions, I just want to mention you can keep in touch with me. This is my email address. I'm always happy to help with questions, resources, happy to give you my opinion on a plant you found. I also just enjoy pretty pictures of plants. You can check out my website. I have information on classes, nature articles I've written, et cetera, et cetera. You can find my social media links there. Here's those. So yeah, that's basically the long and the short of it. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the chat here and get into some questions here. All right. So I'm gonna
Becca,
yeah.
you turned off your camera And so we haven't been able to see you, and it would be nice to be able to see you now. And I couldn't get behind it. I was blocked.
Okay, hang on.
Okay, thanks.
Can you see me now?
A little bit. Looks like the sun went down.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not in the brightest room right now. Do you want me to migrate where you can actually see me?
No, I
Yes,
think
at least we have some visual now. Thank you.
Yeah, I kind of forgot that the sun goes down. Um, one of the things about being in the forest for the better part of a month is you kind of forget. Uh, you lose track of time. Is that better?
yeah, thank you.
Okay. Hi, this is me. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of go through the chat and look for questions. Oh, cool. If you're not checking the chat, there's a cool thing here that somebody mentioned. They found silphium, which was another plant that was thought to be extinct. Uh, let's see here. Yeah, we got into aroma. Um, yeah, good mention here. You really don't want to crush up hemlock without gloves because it can cause rashes. Um, it's got kind of a funky smell as far as I'm concerned. Let's see here. We have a lot of good comments and good discussion. This is awesome. Oh, we got another good suggestion here. Not technically a field guide, but Weeds of the West. Um, yeah, I think I have that one too. There's a couple field guides that specifically focus on non-native plants, like invasive plants. Um, so yeah, having those in your collection is good for at least some of the more common weedy non-natives. Um, Oregon Wildflower Search app, good. Glad somebody brought that up. Oregon Flora, yeah. There's if you're not in the chat, there's some really great resources in the chat window, and if you can't access it, you can probably just email afterwards and get some of these. So, do we have any questions on anything I've talked about?
I'll
Yeah.
make a comment that stinging nettle is actually quite tasty.
Oh yeah.
Fresh picked young leaves. You
Mm-hmm.
crush them in the palms of your hand where the skin is thick enough that the spines don't prick you,
Mm-hmm.
so you get it into a mush already chewed mush in the palm of your hand, and then eat it. It's good on the
Mm-hmm.
trail.
Yeah, no, it's very tasty. And the older, I'll often pick, the little bit older leaves carefully with gloves, and then I'll steam them, and they're really
Oh,
tasty stuff. So yeah, we get a
oh
lot
yeah,
of good. The
yeah.
the
I've
Northwest is wonderful for foraging.
Yeah, I've heard people make tea from the older leaves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes a good pesto too. Other questions, considerations, confusions?
Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca. This was a wonderful presentation. I don't see anything else in the chat, but maybe we can open up people's audio. And if they want to ask a question, they can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I think we should be doing that in the background, and then you should have access to unmute yourself. If you have any other questions for Rebecca, feel free to do that.
And oh, I have a question that's a little left of center, but you did mention, Rebecca, you were doing a residency. Is
Mhm.
that something you can tell us a little bit more about? It sounds really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I have taught a few classes in the summer at the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology. And they also do art residencies where they have artists and writers come in for anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks and stay on campus and then use their uh, uh, studios and so forth. Um, And they've been in the last few years trying to get, they were really heavily canted over toward the art end of things. And they've started trying to push things back toward the ecology as well. And so this year they actually started doing naturalist residencies. And so I applied last year and they accepted me. And so in addition to so if you've ever been out to the Sitka Center, their main campus, beautiful place, has some gorgeous cabins on it in addition to the classrooms and the studios and so forth. But then a few years ago, they acquired a property right down the road. That's an 80-acre old homestead that they're basically doing some habitat restoration on. And it's where I've stayed for the last few years when I teach, because I do the field portions of my classes out here. Because it's such a beautiful place with several different habitat types and a few interesting little micro habitats and so forth. So anyway, my proposed project out here was to catalog the native plants that I found in my time here. And they gave me a window of March 17th to April 17th. So it's all the spring emergent stuff, the early spring stuff. And I didn't know what I was going to do with that list once I got it, but I'm starting to get into some potential writing and art projects, some illustration, botanical illustration. And most of the time, though, I've spent just being on the land, walking around this 80 acres, making note of the plants that I find, noting, where they are in their development, their phenology, etc. And yeah, just really taking a close look at this place in a way that nobody's really had a chance to since they bought the property. So that's basically, I go home a week from tomorrow. So I'm going to take the most of the rest the next week and just absorb this place and look for any species that have popped up since I first got here, and just really make sure I'm thorough in my initial information gathering. So that's the shortest I can get to talking about this without just going blah, 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 blah about it the whole time.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Other questions, other thoughts? All right. Well, again, if you think of something later on, you've got my email address. I'm always happy to, get back to you. Just, it might take me a few days, but I will get back to you.
Awesome.
And yeah.
Yeah, this was wonderful. And you're welcome to stick around for the social part. If you'd like, if you don't have time, that's totally okay too. But yeah, we'll kind of just transition so people can chat, bring up other topics if they'd like